Gracious and kind Heavenly Father, we come before you again today, starting afresh, starting a new study. It's always an exciting time. It's a little scary at times. It can be slightly overwhelming, especially in the beginning. But Lord, we know you have a purpose and you have a plan, and you have prepared us and you have preserved. A lot of peace there. But you have preserved your word for us. It may have not been written to us, but it was written for our edification, for our equipping, so that we can understand ourselves better, we can understand you more fully, and we can walk in your ways. So we ask always and ever, whenever we're approaching your word, that you be with us and that your spirit guide us and teach us. And that as we come together, based on the study we've done throughout the week, that we would just bring some information together in a way that hopefully helps us understand it a little bit better. But no matter what, Father, I ask that you do guide that, and that anything I might say that could be wrong, that they don't even remember it. It just like falls to the floor and it's not remembered, but that you would keep me on track and help me to just lead this discussion, and that we do want it to be a discussion and input and speaking to each other. So guide our discussion, guide it well, and cause us to leave here with what it is you would want us to know. And as I tend to say always, don't leave us unchanged. We want
Bible study.
anything that we do be something that is changing us and causing us to grow. So we ask for that, and we thank you for that, and anticipated what you have for us in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, let me admit something. Okay. All right. So we looked at the first lesson of the study on Judges, and the study, I hope you were able to get your book in. If not, I hope you were able to download the first lesson and have gone through lesson 1. There are 7 lessons in this study, and we will be taking a break on February the 7th, I think it is. So whatever that, it's either the 6th or the 7th of February, because I'll be out of town. I'll let you know as it's coming up. And that will take this study through the end of February, without any other, interruptions, God willing, that we would be able to finish. And then we'll go right into the study of James. So we're kind of in a, like we did the first, second, and third John. Now we're doing Judges. We're in James. We're kind of in this J mode. But I do like going from Old Testament to New Testament and back and forth. Not always. I don't always switch it out like that. But I like doing that. Now, one of the things, if you've done precept upon precept studies before, we just did first, second, and third John, which are epistles, and they're like the perfect, in my opinion, best and perfect way to understand the inductive study method. But it always applies, but it is very different with some of these other books, like the Old Testament books. This one in particular is a book in the section of history and of the Old Testament. If you didn't realize the way the Old Testament and the New Testament are laid out, there's the first books of the Old Testament through the book of Job. Genesis to Job is history. And then Psalms through the Song of Solomon is poetry. And then starting with Isaiah and going through Malachi, you have prophecy. That is how the Old Testament is laid out. I hope that helps, because I know when I first started reading through my Bible and studying, it's not laid out chronologically. Now, Genesis through Deuteronomy somewhat is, but it's like when you get to Nehemiah and all that actually fits later, like in the days of post Daniel, just so you know, historically or chronologically. And then the New Testament is laid out in somewhat history. So that's the Gospels and Acts. And then you have the epistles, which are the letters. And it starts with the Pauline epistles, those written by Paul. And then it's those written by someone else. And if you look at the layout, it's similar in the Old Testament. It's the length of the book comes, so like the bigger books come before the smaller books. It's just the way they laid it out. And then the last book is Revelation. which is prophecy. So that's the interesting layout of somebody logically figured out how to lay out the Old and New Testament. So again, what I was saying about the Old Testament is when you look at the prophets, you've got what we call the major prophets and the minor prophets, which makes it sound like the minor prophets aren't as important. But in reality, the minor prophets are just shorter books. So you've got the major prophets that are bigger books, and they're listed in their length. So Isaiah is the longest, and it's first. And then you've got the minor prophets that are listed, that are in order based on the length. So it can be a little difficult, but that's where a study and cross-referencing helps to understand things. But as we get into Judges, we have just left, if you look at the Bible, you've just left Genesis through Deuteronomy, which is what we call the Pentateuch. That's the first 5 books. Those were written by Moses, and those are also referred to as the law, because that is where the law is written down and given to us and written out. And then you've got Joshua, and then you have Judges. We saw Joshua mentioned in the book of Judges in your study this week. So what we have is the beginning of all time through the fall account, the flood account, and then later you have Abraham coming on the scene, or Abram at first, and then his name is changed to Abraham. And from Abraham, because he's called by God out of the Ur of the Chaldees into the land of Canaan, which is the promised land, the land promised to Abraham. But Abraham did not possess it. He lived there. He was what's called a sojourner, but he did not possess it. He only bought one plot of land where he buried his wife, where he was buried, where his son was buried, and others. And anyway, he had a son, the child of promise, and then his son had 2 sons. That's Jacob and Esau. Jacob is whose name was changed to Israel, and then Israel, Jacob, had 12 sons, and those are the 12 tribes of Israel. And sometimes I have to remind myself that when I say Israel, most of the time I'm talking about a place, like a country. But when you really think of Israel, you need to more so think, possibly, depending on what it's writing, about a person who was Jacob's name changed to Israel. And so in the book of Judges, and I hope you noticed this week that, again, even what we looked at, first Judges 1 and Judges 2, and then we went to 17 to 21, there's a reason and a purpose, which you may or may not have figured out this week, and hopefully we'll be able to look at. But again, it's not necessarily perfectly chronological. For instance, the first verse of Judges 1 says what? What does it refer to?
The death of Joshua.
The death of Joshua. Right. We just had the book of Joshua. Joshua, just to give a little bit of background, was Moses's chosen right-hand man. He was younger than Moses by at least 40 years. And he, at the end of Moses's life, Moses literally handed over the reins to Joshua. So Joshua is the one that brought them into the land. Moses was not allowed to go into the land because he struck the rock twice. He had not represented God correctly in front of the people. It's kind of bizarre, but that's what happened. And so Moses was, God took him, God buried him, and Joshua was put in his place. Now, he also established, he being God through Moses, established Aaron, which is Moses's brother, as the high priest. Okay, so Moses and Aaron are from the tribe of Levi. And it's through the tribe of Levi that we're going to have the royal priesthood. We're going to not just have priests, but we're going to have Levites. And there's a distinction there, but they're all from the tribe of Levi. And then you have Joshua, but Joshua is, I had to go look this up, but Joshua is from the tribe of Ephraim. Ephraim was one of the two sons of Joseph. Ephraim and Manasseh were the two tribes of Joseph, or two sons of Joseph. And Joseph was the one that was sold by his brothers into, he was one of the 12 tribes, one of the 12 brothers. He was sold into slavery into Egypt and rose to prominence under the Pharaoh and saved the world of that time, including his family, through the visions that God had given that he interpreted, and that gave him 7 years of plenty and then 7 years of famine. It was during that 7 years of famine that, because of the measures that Joseph put in place, that Egypt was saved, and so was the world. He fed the world, the world of that area in that day. And then Joseph was reunited with his family and his father, who thought he was dead. And so his father, at the end of his life, put his hands on him, crossed his hands actually, and blessed Joseph's sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. So basically they replaced Joseph in the 12 tribes. So there are two tribes of Joseph. Okay. So we're going to see that a little bit this week, where you'll hear about Joseph, but then you'll also hear about Ephraim and Manasseh. And then you've got the Levites, and the Levites did not get an inheritance in the land. They didn't get a portion of the land laid out for them as an inheritance, because the Lord was their portion. But they were spread out through all of the tribes and were given places to live. They were provided for through the temple system, and they also had places like to raise sheep and stuff like that, but not large sections or a section given to them as an inheritance. So that's where you have what they call the half tribes, which are Manasseh and Ephraim, under Joseph. So there's 12, and then there's actually 11, and then there's 11 plus 1. It's kind of how you have to kind of remember some of this in order to understand. So you've got Joshua brought them into the land. Joshua was the one that walked them around the wall at Jericho. Joshua was the one that led them in war and conquered the land and then divvied it up. Now, God had told Moses, by taking him up on the mountaintop and letting him see the land, who got what. But Joshua is the one that doled it out. And it seemed to come by lots and other things, but God is in control of all of that. So that's a little bit of background and history to get us to kind of where we are today. They're in the land. The 40 years of wandering in the wilderness is past. And one other thing, because it's significant, when they first left Egypt and were in the wilderness and first came to the land, they came to the southern part of the land, but like below it, in the Negev, and they were going to go into the promised land. Moses sent 12 spies, and this is a pretty classic story that most, even like in children's Bible stories, and there's an old song for children that says 10 said no, 2 said go, because the 12 spies came back and gave their report, and the report was very positive. Great land, lots of stuff, abundant food, but 10 said it's scary. There's big people there. We can't go there. It's scary. And 2 said, whoa, we need to go. Well, the 2 that said go were Joshua and Caleb. This Joshua, the Joshua we're talking about here. Joshua, that's where, if you go to Numbers 13, you see the list of the man from which tribe. So Caleb was from the tribe of Judah, and Joshua, his name was Hosea, but Moses called him Joshua, which is, by the way, kind of a precursor name for Jesus. It's the same idea of the one who saves, but Joshua was not only Moses' right-hand man, but he was the representation of the tribe of Ephraim that went in to spy out the land. So those 2 men were the only 2 that stood by what God had said you can do. The other 10 led the entire congregation, the entire people, to say, no, it's too scary, we're not going. And they begged, and along with Moses, like, no, you gotta listen, and they wouldn't. And so then it would, God pronounced judgment on them, and they wandered for 40 years. And the part of the purpose for wandering for the 40 years was to kill off that generation. So that generation was all going to die prior to going into the promised land. Their children were going to get the promise that they refused to take for themselves. But Joshua and Caleb lived through that time because they had been faithful. So they were 40 when they were spies. They were 80 when they went into the land. And if you look in Judges chapter 1, chapter 2, verse 8, it tells you how old Joshua was when he died. So how old was he? 110. Okay, so this gives you, he was 40 when he was a spy. He was 80 when they went into the land. He's 110 when he dies. How many years have passed since they've come into the land? 30. 110 minus 80. 30 years. Okay, so 30 years have passed. They're 100. Joshua and Caleb are about 110 years old, and according to this, what we've seen, Caleb's he was strong, and when he was 80 years old, he was just as strong as he was when he was 40, and that was God. It was all God. Okay, so I've tried to give you a little bit of historical context to get you to where we're jumping into Judges. And at the beginning, verse 1 of Judges 1 says that Joshua has died. But then you go to chapter 2, and it talks about Joshua dying. That's where I'm saying it's not exactly chronological. You have to read what it says and follow where it is. But this is all right at the, this is at the end of Joshua's life. Okay, so the first thing that comes in Judges 1, after it tells you, after Joshua died, they inquire of the Lord and ask what question? What question are they asking?
Who's going to go first against the Canaanites?
Yes, it's a simple question, but again, let's put ourselves in the context. This isn't the first time they've battled. This is 30 years after they're in the land. So they've conquered the land initially. They've initially conquered the land. They have been given their inheritances, so they know where their land is. Each tribe knows their property, where their boundaries are, where their land is, what cities are in there, but they're not done yet. You did some cross-referencing this week on day 2, and you looked at Exodus, Deuteronomy, and even Joshua. And what were the reasons that God gave? Well, what did he say? When you go into the land, what's going to happen?
They will make you sin against me.
Okay, that's
one of the things.
That's one of the things. Now that's if you leave them there. Okay, so but if they're going into the land to conquer the land, what were they promised by God?
He would fight for them.
Yes.
He would lead the way.
Yes, he would fight for them. He'd lead the way, and he would drive out these nations before them, right? That was God's promise to them. Now, this is the group of people that had seen not the people going into the land were the second generation, but their parents had left Egypt. They had experienced the miracles that got them out of Egypt and out from under Pharaoh. After they left Egypt, immediately, the Red Sea parted for them while the Egyptian army was breathing down their necks. And they crossed over on dry land. And when they're in safety, the water covered the Egyptian army and their chariots and drowned them and destroyed the Egyptian army. They saw that. They saw that provision. They had manna given to them, provided for them. They had quail that would literally just fall out of the sky for them. So they were provided for. If they needed water, at first, Moses struck the rock and water came out of the rock. Later, Moses just needed to call forth water from the rock. These were millions of people that God was providing for. But he did provide for them. And there's a lot more that went on during that Exodus period, during that travel, some, even in the good part at the beginning. But these people had seen that. So even when they refused to go into the land, and that generation was going to die out, and the children were raised and saw what God could do, it was the manna, it was the water, it was the quail, it was the provision of God. When they faced an enemy, they won. Joshua led them in battle prior to going into the land, and they won against major forces that were against them, countries that were greatly opposed to them, and on I could go. But they saw the works of the Lord. They saw the miracles of God. Then they go into the land, and they spend 30 years conquering the land and settling. And sorry. Gosh, that knocked me out. Okay, sorry, back. My phone knocked that off for me for a second. Or y'all can, I guess y'all can hear me. I hope you can hear me. But they've spent 30 years conquering the land. Now God told them, I will drive out the nations before you, because these were greater and stronger than the Israelites. So this is kind of the David and Goliath story over and over again. I mean, obviously that's later, but this is, facing major enemies, right? And God was going to drive them out. But he also told them not all of them and not all right away. They were going to be all of them eventually, but not right away. Why was the not right away? What was the reason behind not pushing every nation out immediately?
The wild animals would take over.
Yes. And it's a practical thing. Seriously. If God literally just drove the people out, like they didn't even have to fight, then the land would be unoccupied at first and the beast would take over, right? It'd be similar here. Like if we just abandon, if there was like an island, for instance, that was inhabited and you just left that island, then the plants and the animals would take it over in your absence. I mean, the weeds would come up in the yards and the vines would cover a house. Part of what we do when we occupy a place is we clear it out, we cultivate, we do not all good, but we do occupy it, right? Any abandoned building you see, if it's not maintained, it's going to eventually be taken over by animals or plants or nature. Tree falls, the roof's not repaired, eventually it's destroyed. Okay. So in a similar way, when they came into the land, God couldn't push the people out that were there, that were occupying it completely and immediately. They were going to go in and they were going to conquer and take over the land. And then over time, they were supposed to completely drive out those nations. Okay. Now, let's just stop for a second and understand this is not easy to think about or read or like, seriously, if you put yourself in the shoes of the Kenites and the Canaanites and the Hittites and the Amorites and all the Jebusites, if you put yourself in the shoes of the ites, I mean, I wouldn't be very happy at all if somebody came along and said, I'm taking over your house and your property and you just have to leave, right? Or I don't know about you, but sometimes I stop and think about what would I feel like now or then if I were a Native American. because the land I'm sitting on, they occupied at one time. I don't know that anybody actually felt like they owned my property, but they roamed this area. And we know the history of the Trail of Tears and all of that, because I'm in East Tennessee. This is where it started. You know, Sequoia's birthplace is in my county. And it's a sad part of our history. I can't go back and undo that, unfortunately. But when we put ourselves in their shoes, it feels kind of icky, right? So not to justify and not to, but there is a purpose in this. There is a reason in this. And if you don't know what that is yet, maybe it'll come through our lessons. But again, if you read back through Genesis through Deuteronomy and even into Joshua, God had, when God gave Abraham the covenant and told him the prophecy about them being in captivity for 4 generations, 400 plus years, he said, until the iniquity of the Amorites is complete. And it might be more than that, but I remember that part. You know, it's, I think it's Genesis 12 or 17, if you want to go look it up. So the people that were occupying this land, number one, they were occupying it and they were kind of keeping it, preserving it for when God's people, the Israelites, were coming. They had a purpose, but they were also already judged by God and not his people, and their iniquity, their way of life was not okay at all. So, and God had decided this. That's what we have to start with, is if we look at this from a human perspective, we don't like it and it doesn't make sense, and it doesn't feel right that somebody just goes in and decides and pushes people out because. But that's not what's going on here. This is God's plan. God owns it all, and he gets to decide who lives where. He sets the boundaries and he raises and lowers kings and kingdoms. And so that's what's going on here. All right.
Peggy,
Yes.
a question. So were all the Canaanites considered Amorites? Since he used the term Amorites?
They're different, and yet there might be an overall term Canaanite, like the land of Canaan, but there was a person named Canaan, and these are his people that came from him. There was somebody, I don't know, Amor, I don't know what his name was, but all the ites started with a person's name, just like Israelites came from Israel. Okay. So it kind of is a synonymous term. Like a lot of times we'll just use the term Canaan or Canaanites. But no, there are different people. And if you looked at your chart, or if you remember as you went through, or if we go through here, as like Judah goes and starts conquering, sometimes it's a more specific group, you know, like the Hittites or the Amorites or the whatever, because of where they lived within that section of the world, if that answers your question. Okay, so as we do look through the first chapter of Judges, we've already seen the question was, they inquired of the Lord. That's a good place to start, by the way. Keep in mind what they do, when they do it, good and bad. Like, what are their practice? And remember also, this is something I think is going to come up a lot in Judges, is the Bible was written, not necessarily written to us. Like parts of the Bible, when you read them, that, you know, like there are certain prophecies that are specific to Israel that aren't about America. Okay, so some of the Bible is written not necessarily specifically about us or specifically about to us, but it's all written for our instruction. So we can learn from it, and we don't need to shoehorn it in too much, and we don't need to spiritualize it too much. We just need to see what it says and see how can that apply to me? Like, what can I learn from this? Because it is written for our instruction, all of it. So as we look at this, this is very specific. This is history. This is a place and people and events. But the other thing I was going to say is when we read the Bible, we've got to remember the practices of men are not equal to the principles of God. And the beauty of the way that God writes out the Bible is he doesn't pull any punches. Like he tells all the faults. I don't know if you've ever heard it, but I've often said I wouldn't have written it that way. You know, like if I was writing a novel, I probably wouldn't tell all those parts about my heroes, right? The ones that I want you to like. But God doesn't pull any punches. When you read the story of David, a man after God's own heart, you also realize that David had major failures in his life that carried through his children and carried through the nation of Israel, divided it later, et cetera, et cetera. And yet he was still considered and is called a man after God's own heart. But he wasn't perfect. Only Jesus was perfect. Okay, so they inquire of the Lord. Good thing. That's a good practice, good place to start. And God tells them, Judah shall go up. Behold, I've given the land into his hands. Now, he's not talking about all the land. He's talking about Judah's land. He's talking about Judah's inheritance. And he says, and Judah looks at Simeon. Now, understand, we're not talking about the man Judah, and we're not talking about the man Simeon. They're long past. You know, they died in Egypt, and this is their tribe. So sometimes we have to just like remember that. But there was a man named Judah, and there was a man named Simeon. But so the Judites and the Simeonites, Judah asked the other tribe, Simeon, will you go with me? And if you look at the layout of the land, if you've got the map, you see that Judah is at the southern portion and Simeon is actually below him. So it kind of makes sense that they would join forces, right? And then he says, come up with me into the territory allotted me that we may fight against the Canaanites. And in turn, I will go to your territory allotted to you. So Simeon went with him, and Judah went up, and the Lord gave the Canaanites and the Perizzites. So the Canaanites were like what he mentioned before. But again, we've got these different peoples, the Perizzites into their hands, and they defeated 10,000 men at Bezek. Sometimes on your map, you can find these locations and sometimes you can't. But that was that goes through verse 4. And then it says, and they found Adonai-Bezek in Bezek and fought against him, and they defeated the Canaanites and the Perizzites. One of the things you'll find if you read the Old Testament a lot of times is you will find a city you'll find a city that's named after a person. And sometimes you'll hear something like Adonai-Bezek is obviously someone tied to Bezek. He might have been the founder of Bezek, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, so you just always have to forgive me for that. But Adonai is actually a name of God. And so a lot of times these are like they've taken on a title or they've taken on a God name and added it. Maybe his name was Bezek and now he's like the king of Bezek or whatever the Adonai represents there. And then it says, but in verse 6, but Adonai-Bezek fled and they pursued him and caught him and cut off his thumbs and big toes. And then the response of this Adonai-Bezek is 70 kings with their thumbs and their big toes cut off used to gather up scraps under my table. As I have done, so God has repaid me. So they brought him to Jerusalem and he died there. Bizarre stuff. Not recommended, by the way. I don't recommend you take up this practice. But what do you learn about what Adonai-Bezek says? I mean, I believe this is true. He's saying, what had he done? And he felt this was repayment.
He used to pick up scraps under his table.
Yes, these kings that he had 70 kings he had conquered. And when he conquered them, apparently the practice was to cut off their thumbs and cut off their big toes. That would be limiting. You know, your big toe is a lot of balance. Your thumbs, I mean, we can't, our opposable thumb is what differentiates us from the apes and monkeys, right? You know, we can do things like this, like we can grasp things. So if you don't have a thumb, I can pick up things with my fingers without my thumb, but it's really hard to do a lot of things. Plus, it would identify you, right? So what he's done is he's conquered them. He's cut off their thumbs and toes. He's brought them to his kingdom. And for the rest of their lives, they ate from his table, ate scraps from his table. This is humiliating. This is constant, ongoing humiliation. It's that constant subduing, right? Plus, it would show everybody all the time, I conquered these 70 men that you see right here. I conquered them. I'm a big wig. I'm a big guy. But when he was captured and conquered, they did the same to him. And his response is, I did it to 70. The Lord is repaying me. Okay. And they brought him to Jerusalem and he died there. Okay. So that's the first paragraph. And then in 8 through 10, you've got, they're talking about going to Jerusalem. We know Jerusalem, but you have to understand at this point, Jerusalem isn't what we know it to be later. Right? Because this is the days of the judges. We haven't gotten to the days of the kings yet. In the days of the kings, the second king was David. David's the one that set up Jerusalem as the capital. This is long before that, like hundreds of years before Jerusalem is set up as the capital. All right. But again, timeline, we got to remember when this is happening. But even at this point, Judah, the sons of Judah, fought against Jerusalem and captured it and struck it with the edge of the sword and set the city on fire. And afterwards, the sons of Judah went down to fight against the Canaanites living in the hill country and in the Negev, which is the south country. That's what that word means. And in the lowland. So if you look at your map and you see where Jerusalem is, also remember Jerusalem was the highest point, like elevation wise, the highest point. So whenever in scripture you hear Jerusalem mentioned, we're going up to Jerusalem. Even the Psalms that are the Psalms of ascent, 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 meaning they're climbing a hill. Ascent, they're climbing. Okay, so Jerusalem was the highest point, so everything away from that would be low. But and not just because it's the southern part of the map, but in the southern part of your map, that's the low country, that's the Negev, and there's south country, and there's also hill country. So there's rolling hills throughout. There's places throughout that if we had a topographical map, we could see that. And then there's cities named like Hebron, and Hebron was formerly called Kiriath Arba, and they struck Shisha, Ahaman, and Talmai. I don't know if those are cities or people. And it says, then from there, he went against the inhabitants of Debir. Now the name of Debir was formerly Kiriath Sefer. So again, I have no idea if I'm pronouncing any of that correctly. So you can read it, and that's what it says. Then we've got Caleb. We hear about Caleb, and Caleb says, now remember, Caleb is from the tribe of Judah. So during this time, when Judah is fighting with Simeon, helping him and trying to completely conquer their property, their land, they have it, they're in it, they semi-conquered it, now they're going to clear it all out. Caleb is one of the main guys. But remember, at this point, because it started with Joshua dying, Caleb's 110 years old. He's at least 100 and something when we're reading about this. And he's leading He's not sitting in a chair somewhere. He's not directing. It says he's there. It says, and Caleb said, the one who attacks Kiriath Sepher and captures it, I will give him my daughter Ekshah for a wife. And Othniel, the son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother. So Othniel is Caleb's nephew. So that makes Othniel and Akshah first cousins, if you do the genealogy, if I got my genealogy right, okay? But Caleb's younger brother, Kenaz, Othniel is the son, captured the city, and therefore Caleb gives his daughter as a wife. And then she comes to him and says, okay, you've given me the Negev, which is the southern country, but you need to give me water too. So he gives them springs of water. The upper springs and the lower springs. We all know the impact of, you can have land, but you got to have water in order for your crops and for your flocks and herds or whatever you have. Okay, so that's the account in Judges 1 of Judah, the tribe, going to clear out their land. Did they do a good job?
Yes, they did.
Sound like they did a good job, right? Okay, because it's important that we differentiate, but they sound like they do a good job. And Caleb is still active, alive, and getting. Now, Caleb is given Hebron as his inheritance. I think if you look back in the law, in the Pentateuch, you'll see that when they went into, maybe it's in Joshua, when they went into the land, he kind of decided where he wanted, but he still was part of conquering it all. Like, he didn't just go and settle and be done. He helped conquer all the land of Judah. Okay, then in 16 through 21, you've got the descendants of the Kenite Moses, Moses' father-in-law. They live among the tribe of Judah. So Moses was married, had a father-in-law that was a Kenite, and they came with the Israelites in their wanderings and settled in the land with them. That's what it's talking about here. That group of people, it says, went up from the city of palms with the sons of Judah to the wilderness of Judah, which is in the south of Arad, and they went and lived with the people. Then Judah went out with Simeon. Okay, so the promise Judah made, if you'll come and help me, he's fulfilling, or they are fulfilling. And so Judah goes with Simeon, and they struck the Canaanites living in Zephath and utterly destroyed it. So the name of the city was called Hormah. And Judah took Gaza with its territory, and Ashkelon with its territory, and Ekron with its territory. Those are coastal. And now the Lord was with Judah, and they took possession of the hill country, but they could not drive out the inhabitants of the valley because they had iron chariots. Then they gave Hebron to Caleb as Moses had promised, and he drove out from there 3 sons of Anak. But the sons of Benjamin did not drive out the Jebusites who lived in Jerusalem. So the Jebusites have lived with the sons of Benjamin in Jerusalem to this day. Okay. So it sounded like they were doing really well, but then they didn't completely drive them out as far as the Canaanites are concerned. They, or whoever is in the valley, sorry, it doesn't say, whoever was in the valley, because they had iron chariots. Now, who else in the history of Israel do we know of that had iron chariots that God utterly destroyed?
Egyptians.
The Egyptians. When they came
Yeah.
after the Israelites at the Red Sea and had them hemmed in, they were in chariots, right? So could God with the Judah have run these out?
Mhm.
Yeah. I mean, it says they did not, they couldn't, and they did not, but they could have. We've got to keep that in mind. And then it says the Benjamites did not drive out the Jebusites who lived in Jerusalem, but Judah had conquered Jerusalem. Now it's saying the Benjamites, and it's something I don't quite, maybe we'll have this answered later, but Jerusalem is kind of at the borderline, I guess, of Benjamin and Judah. So I don't know. I don't know if that's why we hear Jerusalem mentioned in both places. But verses 22 through 28, actually 22 through 26, talk about Joseph, and then 27 and 28 talk about Manasseh. But then you've got to realize, again, Joseph had two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. So when it talks about Joseph here, we have to think, is it talking about Ephraim or is it talking about Manasseh? It says, the house of Joseph went up against Bethel, and the Lord was with him. And the house of Joseph spied out Bethel. Now the name was formerly Luz. And the spies saw a man coming out of the city, and he decided to help him. He showed him how to get into the city. And it says, and then they let the man and his family go free. And he went into the land of the Hittites and built a city named Luz. So they conquered his city called Luz, and he went somewhere else and built a city called Luz among the Hittites. And then it says in 27, Manasseh did not take possession. So now we're starting to see this idea of some of them did not go forward. Manasseh did not take possession of Bethshean and its villages, and it names all these other villages. So the Canaanites persisted in living in that land. And it came about when Israel became strong, and they put the Canaanites to forced labor, but they did not drive them out completely. Okay, so we have to start thinking. So we begin to see this idea. They did not drive them out completely, and they put them to forced labor, right? Okay, so first we have, during the days of Joshua, they conquered. But some were left. For a time, some of the peoples were left. And that there was a purpose. We've already talked about that. That purpose was because they had to kind of occupy until, or the beasts and the land would just go to rot. So there was a reason for this, but they were warned. And Sandy mentioned this earlier. They were warned not to leave them because there would be a snare. I was going to say spy, but there would be a snare, a trap, thorns. There are all these words that we're talking about what would happen if they left these people among them. They were going to be there for a while, but they were not to be left among them, because not just the people, but their gods, their idol worship, their gods would end up being a snare. Okay. Could they have driven out these people? No matter what you see here, iron chariots or anything else, could they have driven out? Yes, they could have driven them out. Okay, so is this they couldn't, or is this they didn't or wouldn't? It's they didn't and they wouldn't. Okay. Whenever in our lives we view something as too big for us, too hard for us, too scary for us to do, and yet we know, now this is the condition. Like, I can't come, I'm looking at Sandy's face, I can't come to Sandy's house and say, this is what God has told you to do in this situation, unless it's a very black and white issue. Like, I had a family member once say to me years ago, you know, God wants me to be happy, therefore God has brought this other man into my life while I'm married. And I'm like, no, that's not how God works. You know, no. And she was completely convinced. She convinced herself. She tried to convince everybody else. And I'm like, no, it's very clear in scripture. No. Okay. So yes. And she was like, you can't know God's will more than me. I can if it's clear. I can if it's right. But can I know whether or not you're supposed to take a certain job? Or can I know whether or not you're supposed to watch a certain TV program at a certain time? And no, I can't know those things for you, but I can ask God's guidance for my own life and be convinced. And Paul even says, be fully convinced in your own mind, meaning, you know, be convinced. Don't convince yourself and don't, you know, whatever. So we've got to look at this and say, when we face something that's huge, that's scary, if we know we're supposed to, and that God does want us to, not would want, but does want us to, we can know we can face that. We can know we can conquer in whatever way that is. We can conquer that. We can overcome it. We can know that instead of telling ourselves or compromising and leaving. I remember years ago hearing, I wish I remember who it was, but some, great man of God, give a picture. I think it was Colson. No, I can't remember who it was. Anyway, and he was given a picture of, and some of you have heard me say this. Let's say I owned 100 acres of property, and it was perfectly contained within these, fences, right? And you wanted to buy that property from me. And I said, okay, but here's the conditions. I keep 1 acre, just 1 acre. And it's right centered in the very middle of that 100 acres. And I have unlimited access to it. I can get there however I want to get there. And you're like, I get 99 acres? I'm okay with that. And I stomp all over your 99 acres as I get to my one. Anytime I want to. I plow through your fences. I drive over your whatevers. I do whatever I want because that was our agreement. And the picture is this. Is that how we give our life to God? We say, I'll give you 99 of my acres, but I'm keeping this one. Keeping this one. And it's going to be right in the center of who I am. I'm keeping this 1 acre, and Satan's going to stomp all over the 99 because I've given him access to the one. And that's what we see here is they went into the land. They took possession of much of it and many of the cities, but they did not completely do what God told them to do because in their minds, oh, those are bigger people than me. When it says very simply that Caleb drove out 3 of the Anaks were giants. The Anakim is what they're called. They were giants. They were if you've ever seen the description of Goliath or read about it, he was somewhere in the range of 9 or more feet tall. Massive. His spear was a tree trunk. An average person couldn't pick it up. That's who Caleb faced at 100+ years old and defeated. Not he, but with God, defeated. Okay, so when they say, oh, there's chariots, we couldn't defeat them. God defeated the Egyptians with their chariots. But it also tells you that this group of people, this area is not without its resources. These are strong groups of people that the Israelites were up against. And Israelites aren't known to be huge people. They're not big. When the spies came back, the 12 spies came back, they're like, we were like grasshoppers to them, like they were so big. So it's scary, I get it. But when God says, go into the land and drive them out, because if you don't, they're going to be a snare to you. They're going to be a thorn in your side. It's going to be a problem, thorn in your eyes, I think, or something like that. Okay, so in these next, where you've got verse 29, neither did Ephraim drive out the Canaanites who were living in Gezer. So the Canaanites lived in Gezer among them. And then 30, you've got Zebulun. In 31, you've got Asher. In 33, you've got Naphtali. And in each case, they did not drive them out. They did not drive them out. And then in 34, it says the Amorites forced the sons of Dan into the hill country, for they did not allow them to come down to the valley. For those of us who live in East Tennessee, some of y'all live up in the mountains, but how easy, especially back in the day before the roads we have, how easy is it to navigate those mountains versus how easy is it to navigate the valleys? How much planting do we do up on those rocky hillsides as opposed to how much planting can we do in the fertile valleys? You can run sheep and goats and cows up in the hills. You can do that. And that's, by the way, the agriculture of East Tennessee basically was more animal based than large property plant based, because we don't have the flatlands that they have like out in West Tennessee or out in the Midwest. So, kind of a practical thing, it's harder to live in the hill country. So if somebody came in, the Danites came in, and this group of people said, we're not giving up our prime property. You can go up in the hills, but you don't get the valley. And the Danites did not run them out. And it said the Amorites persisted in living in Mount Heres and Aishalon and Shalbim. This is so hard to say these words. But when the power of the house of Joseph grew strong, they became forced labor. Okay, so here's the second thing is Joshua conquered overall, and then the individual tribes were, got to the point where they did not drive out. Was always that little remnant in there, but they put them to forced labor. I know this is a dirty word, but forced labor is slavery. There's no other way of putting that. Maybe not exactly the slavery that we had here in America, but it's close enough. You don't have a choice, right? How strong do you have to be to put a group of people to forced labor? Very strong enough to drive them out. Yeah. They made a choice. Sometimes they looked at something that was big and said, we can't do it. Sometimes they allowed themselves to be run off. But in any, like Judah and Simeon got together and worked together. Why did the Danites not do something like that? Call on a fellow tribe and say, help us out. They were all doing their own thing. That's one thing. Okay. So now in Judges 2, you have, it says the angel of the Lord. Now, when it says the angel, it could possibly be a pre-incarnate Jesus. Let's just say, because there's other places in scripture, maybe. But we've got the angel of the Lord that came down from Gilgal to Bochum, and he said, I brought you up out of Egypt. So he's speaking for the Lord. I brought you up out of Egypt and led you into the land which I've sworn to your fathers. And I said, I will never break my covenant with you. That's God's side of things. God, I will never break my covenant with you. But as for you, you are to make no covenant with the inhabitants of the land, and you shall tear down their altars. There's a big but there. What did they do?
They didn't obey.
Right. So we're starting to see a pattern here. We're seeing partial obedience. Is partial obedience ever obedience? No. That's one of probably the biggest things that in our lives we need to remember. Partial obedience is never obedience. It's 100% or it's not. It's either or. And we justify it in our brains. We deal with children and we go, well, they eventually did what I told them to do, even though their attitude was lousy and I got mouthing off and, whatever. Or it was close, and so I just fixed it. You're not teaching your child anything other than partial obedience, which is not obedience. If they were told not to make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land, and they were to tear down their altars, but they did not do that. And he said, therefore, as a result, God says, I will not drive them out before you, but they shall be as thorns in your sides, and their gods shall be a snare to you. The thing he had warned them about, he is now saying is going to happen. They did not obey. Therefore, God kept his promise. He promised he would not break his covenant with them, which is wonderful, but he also had promised them, if you don't do this, this is what's going to happen. And since they didn't do that, he's going to make it happen, or let it happen, or allow, these people are going to be a thorn in their sides, and their gods will be a snare. It's not just the people, their gods are going to be a snare to you. And then it says, then they wept. And that's why the place is called Bochum, because it's weepers. The Bochum, however you pronounce it, just means weepers. So they named the place Bochum, and there they sacrificed to the Lord. When Joshua had dismissed the people, so in chapter 2, Joshua is still alive. So this is prior to the very first events of Joshua 1. And it says, he dismissed the people, the sons of Israel went each to his inheritance to possess the land. And the people served the Lord all the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders who had survived Joshua, who had seen all the great work of the Lord, which he had done for Israel. Then Joshua dies at the age of 110. And they buried him in the hill country of his inheritance, in the hill country of Ephraim, north of Mount Gaash. And all the generation also were gathered to their fathers, and all there arose another generation after them that did not know the Lord and the work that he had done. So there's a generation that did not know the Lord. Did they have? Should they have?
Yeah.
Yes. When you remember, if you've ever read or studied it, what happened in the days of Moses, when they crossed the Jordan, or this is the days of Joshua, when they crossed the Jordan, one of the things they did is they took rocks out of the Jordan, and on both sides, they piled them up, created a standing stone altar type thing. And when they were told, when you're with your children and they point to that pile of rocks and say, Dad, what is that? They were to tell the stories. When God gave them the tabernacle and later the temple, and they had the feasts and festivals, every one of those feasts and festivals was to remind. Because as I say, we have leaky brains, we forget things. It was to remind. So again, with our lives, with our children, with our grandchildren, we are to not just tell them of our faith and not just show ourselves to be Christians. That's great. But we need to help them have their own. Because if you look at it's sometimes it's called the 3 chairs. You look at the three chairs. And this is the first generation, which would be like the Israelites, or this generation they're talking about that has died out. In the second chair, you've got children that are associated with God, but the second chair means they don't have their own relationship with God. And when you get to this third generation, they're gone. They're gone. If each generation doesn't end up in the first chair with their own personal relationship with God, that generation's gone. And we have a tendency to, think, well, my parents were, or my grandfather was, or my dad was, or my mom was, or whatever. And that somebody else's salvation doesn't get you there. Every individual person needs to have their own. And the other question is, are we witnessing the parting of the Red Sea? Are we witnessing, these vast and major miracles that this group of people witnessed when they were coming out of Egypt or wandering in the desert? Like, when was the last time you saw manna on the ground and went out and picked it up? Or quails just falling out of the sky, right? Or a man's arms raised and the army prevails. When have you seen any of that? We haven't. But does that keep us from knowing the miracles of God in our own lives? Number one, my salvation is a miracle in and of itself. But there's other times when, and sometimes the stories are big, and sometimes we just need to look around and realize that God's at work all the time. And we need to recognize it and keep that fresh in our minds so that we know the Lord. And then our goal is that our children know the Lord, not through me, not because of me, but I'm going to help them have their own relationship. And then our grandchildren, that they're not riding on our coattails. It's got to be their own. And it says, as a result of them, they did not know the Lord. There was a generation that did not know the Lord. They did evil in the sight of the Lord. And they did this by forsaking the Lord, going after the Baals and the Ashtoreth. Those are just specific gods they were worshiping because of the snare and the trap and the gods of the people of the land. And the next thing is the anger of the Lord. So this would take some time, but this is starting to show the pattern. You've got, they did evil on the side of the Lord. They forsook the Lord, and they went after the gods of the land, and the anger of the Lord burned against them. What would God do as a result?
Sent judges.
Before that, yes, he did send the judges, but before that, what did he do with the people?
Sold them into the hands of the enemies.
Okay. Yes. And the judges were the solution in the moment. And that's because God would hear the weeping and the wailing, because it was bad. When he gave them over into the hands of their enemies and sold them to their plunderers, it was bad. And God would have pity on them in their distress, and he would raise up a judge, and that judge would usually also be a warrior. Like he would get them out of that particular mess and situation. And as long as that judge was alive, they would kind of follow the ways of the Lord, and that judge would die, and the pattern would start all over again. They would do evil in the side, but they never gave up their stubborn ways. That was the other thing. So again, even with it reminds me very much of, of children. Like, as long as you've got somebody that's there that's cracking the whip over them, you can kind of keep them in line. But as soon as the teacher leaves the room and goes to the office, there's chaos in the classroom, right? It's that kind of thing. As long as there was somebody there to put that hand on them and hold them in place, they would kind of stay in line. But they never knew the Lord. They never gave up their evil ways. They never gave up their stubborn ways, as it says in verse 19. And therefore, it was always there. It was always beneath the surface. It was always ready to just bubble up to the surface. And so as long as the judge was there, as long as the judge lived. Now, we're going to see this throughout the book of Judges. We did jump to 17 through 21 and just looked at a couple of more phrases. Which are tied together, and you were supposed to mark them, which was, there was no king, right?
There was no king in Israel.
No king in Israel. And what was the result of that?
Every man did what was right in his own eyes.
Okay. So every man did what was right in his own eyes, but notice what is it said over here. What they did was evil in the sight of the Lord. So depending on who's looking at the situation, us You know, this is the God side, this is the man side. The Godward side is what they were doing was evil. The manward side is like, everything's right in my eyes. I'm fine. Everything I'm doing is fine. And the idea that it's no king in Israel, number one, this is the day of the judges. This is not the days of kings. We know that's coming. We got to kind of pull that out of our brains for just a second. They're living in a day when there was no king because they weren't supposed to have a king. So it wasn't like they've had a king, now they don't have a king. You know, we know kings are coming. We know that Solomon's coming. I'm sorry, Saul and then David and then Solomon, etc. But in this time, this is before that time. It's not, this book is not just saying, you know, someday there's going to be kings. It's saying instead of every individual person is supposed to be self-governed. Do you know what our country is based on? Self-governance. Right?
We the people.
If you go back to our original documents and our founding fathers' purpose and desire and placement of things, is that it doesn't work if an individual person isn't self-governed. And where are we? Pretty much from the beginning, actually, but where are we in America? Every man is doing what is right in his own eyes. And guess what? It's evil in the sight of the Lord. Right? So 17 through 22, we'll get to those chapters. We'll look at them more fully. It's bizarre stuff. Really, the point of reading, I said 22, but 21, reading through 17 through 21, the main thing you need to see is there was no king in Israel and every man did what was right in his own eyes. And when you read the details, it's bizarre. It's very much spelled out. You know, you've got this Levite, by the way, you've got a Levite who's not a priest. Got to separate those two ideas. Just because he's from the tribe of Judah does not mean he's from Aaron, because it's only the Aaronites who are Levites, but it's only from Aaron that the priests come. The rest of the tribe of Levi was to help the priests themselves, you know, the Aaronites. They should have been serving the people in all of Israel and all the land, but they should have been having their purpose and their time at the tabernacle serving. That and there were times and schedules for all of that, and apparently that wasn't going on. You have this random guy who goes to this random house and becomes that man's priest. And by the way, they had graven images and molten images that he had set up and the household gods. This is not the way God said to do it. That Levite should have known more than anybody else. And then another group comes along and says, come with us. Wouldn't it be better for you to be over a whole tribe than just one household? And, you know, so that was Dan going after trying to find their territory because they had not taken over theirs like they should have. So there's a lot in 17 to 21. Main idea that we need to take from it is every man was doing what was right in his own eyes. But also remember, it was evil in the sight of the Lord. And so who's looking at it? And there's this process. They did evil in the sight of the Lord. They forsook the Lord. They went after other gods, the gods of the lands, the snare and the trap and the thorns that God had warned them about, because they did not get rid of the people in the land. They would go into a time of desperation. God would have pity on them. He would raise up a judge. The judge would help deliver them, and they would follow after the judge. The judge would die. They'd go back into this process over and over and over again. And the main thing we need to take away from this is, where are we? Personally, but also where are we as a nation? And we're going to see this more and more through Judges. And just remembering that Judges was written about a very specific time and people, and we can take some great truths out of it and apply them to ourselves and our lives. So we're over our time as usual, and we're going to stop, but we will continue with your lesson next week. Lesson 2 is on chapter 3. If you don't understand what they mean by chapter studies and all, there's some information at the very back in the appendix. There's also the book, How to Study Your Bible by Kay Arthur, that you can order from the website. And it'll explain what to do throughout, but mainly follow the lesson, do what she asks you to do to the best of your ability, and you're going to be doing well. And then just like, how did you title chapter 1? Did you come up with a title?
I called it Not Fully Conquering Canaan.
Very good. That's a good one. But they also were strong. So like I said, when Israel was strong, they didn't drive out the Canaanites. So you're right, not fully conquering. That's the main idea and the problem lumped into one, right? It's not just what happened, it's the problem they created for themselves. How about chapter 2?
Consequences of
God.
not.
Consequences, I heard, and then something else. I heard somebody else talking.
Say, they didn't listen to God.
Okay, they didn't listen. And there's the consequences as a result of that. I said Israel did evil, and therefore there was God's anger, and as a result, God did not drive out. Okay, so there's always that parallel. Like if God warned them, they have their responsibility. When they didn't do their responsibility, not only did the natural consequence happen, there was a snare, there was a trap, and all of that, but God also comes along with his constructive consequence, which is he did not continue to drive them out. And we can't forget, he says in verse 22 of chapter 2, he left them, these nations, he left them in order to test Israel by them to see whether or not they would keep the way of the Lord and walk as their fathers did or not. So we don't like to think about God testing us, but life does. I mean, not just life, but God tests us through our life circumstances. And the question is always, are you going to do things the way God says to do them, or are you not? And we see that they didn't. And obviously, always remember, there are individuals involved in this. There's always a remnant. There are some that would have, but we're not seeing those yet. We're not seeing anybody other than Caleb maybe mentioned and Joshua at one point. But we're gonna stop, and I'll finish with prayer. And then we'll come back about 11:30 and watch the video for those who want to stay for that. And remember, I will send the links to both if you have to leave. You can watch the video later. But Heavenly Father, it's a lot. It's just a few chapters, but it is a lot. But I know, Father, that you have a purpose and a plan in it, and something that you want us to take individually from this, collectively as a group from this, and to go forth into this world and speak this truth into the world, that it is not okay for us or anyone else to do what is right in our own eyes. We see the mess our country is in right now because that is exactly what's going on. We as a country, as a nation, have forsaken you. We've gone off after our own Baals and Ashtaroths or gods or molten images or whatever, even if we don't have a statue set up in our home. There are people in this country, all of us, that are worshiping ourselves, if nothing else. Show that in our lives and shine that light so that we can eradicate that. We can just get it out, and that we can walk fully in obedience to you. But also help us to walk in this world, telling those that we love and care about and that you bring into our path and our lives to speak to, that we can speak this truth to them, that doing things that are right in our own eyes is evil in your sight, that we are to drive out the world's ways from our lives, and that you will go before us to do that. It's not in my strength, it's in yours anyway. So I don't have to worry about how hard it is. I know that you will be with me to do it with me. But if I don't, you won't. So help me to understand how this applies to me. And as always, don't leave me unchanged. I want to change. I want to grow. And I want to see what you have for me to do with this information and for others. So we ask for all that. Thank you for it. We ask for the lesson that we're going to get from Kay through the video to just be exactly what it is, that you would open our eyes to the truth of what it is we need to know, and take us into our next week as we do our next lesson, and bring those who maybe couldn't be here today, be with those who can't join us in real time, but watch the videos later as well. We ask for it all in your name and for your sake as well. Amen.